Hello, everyone. It is 6:30. I am going to officially get started here. First and foremost, welcome to the Citizen 2020 Indigenous Media Panel. I want to say a special thank you to all of our guest speakers and welcome you to this evening's event. I am Caroline Lowry. I'm the Executive Director for Oklahoma Humanities. And this specific panel is part of a larger initiative nationwide called Democracy and the Informed Citizen, funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation and the Federation for State Humanities Councils. If you like this program, I encourage you to head on over to our website, okhumanities.org, register for our other virtual panels, subscribe to our Brain Box podcast, which hopefully Chris shamelessly plugs later, sign up to receive our special expanded double issue of our magazine. And if you are just a super fan, you can also donate to support programs like this securely on our webpage as well. So with that, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Chris Carroll.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who's joining us this evening for a discussion about the history and important current issues in Indigenous media. We have a really great panel, so we'll just do some quick introductions and we'll get right into some questions. I'm Chris Carroll. I'm a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities, and I'm also the host of our Brainbox podcast. Let's go to Lenzy, if you'll do a quick introduction.
Sure. CEO, my name is Lenzy Krehbiel-Burton. I'm a full-time freelance reporter based out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm the Vice President of the Native American Journalists Association.
And how about Graham, if you'll introduce yourself next.
Hey, I'm Graham Lee Brewer. I'm an associate editor for Indigenous Affairs at High Country News. I'm also a board member at the Native American Journalists Association and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation.
And Bryan, if you'll give a quick introduction.
I'm Bryan Pollard. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and the Associate Director of the Native American Journalists Association. I also recently completed a John S. Knight Fellowship at Stanford University, where I studied the value of an independent press in Indian country. And before that, I was the executive editor of the Cherokee Phoenix.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us for this discussion. And I'd like to start with a question for you, Bryan, about kind of the earliest days of Indigenous media. If you could tell us a bit about kind of the early history, that would help give us some context for what we'll be talking about later.
So when you think about the modern era of Cherokee or Indigenous journalism, it really started in the Cherokee Nation in 1828 with the publishing of the Cherokee Phoenix. And when I say the modern era, I'm really referring to media that's using technology like the printing press. And the Cherokee Phoenix was really unique at the time. Not only was it the first Native American newspaper, it was also the first bilingual publication that was published in both English and Cherokee. And you really, it's not until 1943 that we see the next Native American newspaper published, which was published by the Navajo Nation. And it was a monthly newspaper that was published entirely in the Navajo language. But there's an important distinction to be made between those two publications. The first Cherokee Phoenix was published not just as a means to inform the citizenry of the Cherokee Nation about current events. It also was very much a political act in opposition to the forces that were trying to remove Cherokees from their homelands. And Elias Boudinot, who was the executive editor, believed that a newspaper could provide a counter narrative in many ways to the prevailing narrative, the anti-Indian narrative that Indians were somehow uncivilized and not deserving of the land that they occupied. And he believed that starting a newspaper could be a means of countering that narrative. But there was a shift after Indian removal, and when we see the Navajo Nation starting their first newspaper, it was not an externally focused message. In other words, it wasn't trying to set an example to people outside of the nation. It was very internally focused. It was for Navajo or for Dene citizens. It was completely focused on them. And what we have seen going forward in the 1900s and into the 2000s is tribal media has flourished. There are hundreds of tribal media outlets across Indian country, but they are all very much internally focused. So that they are a service to their community, and they bind together a sense of identity in those tribal communities.
Well, I wanted to throw a question out to all of you that's connected to kind of the main theme of our Citizen 2020 initiative. And I wonder if you could address just maybe in a perfect world, what role do you think journalists should play in a democracy? Maybe Lenzy, if you could tackle that first.
We're the fourth estate for a reason. In a perfect world, we're the ones holding our elected and appointed officials accountable, asking all the questions so that they're not getting flooded with 400 people, chasing them down saying, no, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this?
Graham, what are your thoughts about the role of journalists in a democracy?
Oh, I mean, I think just piggybacking off what Lenzy said, if we didn't do it, I don't know who would. I mean, I think just ask yourself how many things that concern you about the way the government works, whether it's locally or nationally, that you know about because of the press. And so I think the press is a vital and integral component to the discussion of not just how do we make things equitable and fair, but how do we improve them and make them evolve and adapt to the changing culture and society that, we're definitely seeing a change right now. And I don't think anything is going to be different after this year. So, or the same, I'm sorry, after this year. And so, sorry.
What do you think, Bryan? Do you have any additional thoughts?
No, I agree with what's been said, and accountability is vital to really having a healthy community. Whether you're talking about democracy or just other aspects of a functioning government that is a service to its people, and Indigenous media, I think, plays an even more important role, simply because Indigenous media is going to have access to the government affairs of a tribal government that an outside media organization isn't going to have necessarily. Tribal governments can be somewhat shrouded, and oftentimes just acting as a sovereign government, they do not necessarily need to be responsive to mainstream media outlets. Whereas Indigenous media is going to have more access to that. And so providing accountability among tribal governments is going to be an essential function of Indigenous media.
Bryan, when you and I talked about this issue a while back, you told me about there are some unique roles of Indigenous media that non-Indigenous people probably are not aware of, and that non-Indigenous media may not tackle itself. Could you talk a little bit about those roles?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that there are several things that Indigenous media does that we don't really necessarily see reflected in mainstream media. And one is that it reaffirms culture, right? And so cultural values and traditions find their way into the pages of the newspaper or on the radio waves of the tribal radio station. And it acts to, as I mentioned earlier, it creates and reinforces a sense of identity among all the people of the tribe. Similarly, it also is a strong reinforcer of language. Many tribal radio outlets, for example, have radio shows just in their ancestral language. The Cherokee Phoenix, for example, was, I mentioned earlier, it was published in English and Cherokee. That's a tradition it carries on to this day. The Navajo Times publishes in English and Dene. And so the perpetuation and the vitalization of the language happens with each and every issue of a tribal newspaper, or each time a radio program is pushed out on the airwaves. And that's something that is informs and undergirds Indigenous self-determination. And it's not something that we necessarily recognize or expect out of mainstream media, but it's very much a part of Indigenous media.
Graham and Lenzy, do you have any additional thoughts about these roles?
I think one other thing that Indigenous media does is it also gives Indigenous readers the opportunity to see reporters that look like them reporting about the communities that they live in. I think if you look at things like the Cheyenne Arapaho television network that has a children's program that not only teaches language, but it has puppets and real Cheyenne and Arapaho people who can be role models for the children who watch that, and that's made possible through an Indigenous tribes media network. FNX, Aboriginal People's Television Network, is another great example. And so it has a much stronger impact in that area, because as I think many of us are now aware that newsrooms really don't have a lot of Indigenous reporters and producers and editors working in them. It's less than 0.5% nationwide. And so tribal media presents an opportunity that national media wouldn't. And when I go to the absentee Shawnee clinic, not too far from my house, and I pick up their newspaper, there's, they print off full pages of voter registration forms, and the tribal council members who write op-eds put their cell phone numbers at the bottom of their articles. I mean, so it's a way to, it's one of the best examples of real, true community journalism I think you'll find in the country.
And Graham kind of touched on this, but it's also, I mean, think back growing up, if your picture showed up in the paper, your mom made a big deal about it, grandma, auntie, and that's still happening. I mean, whereas versus, if you're in a more urban area like I am, I love my friends at the Tulsa World, but they're all stretched a little thin, and they're probably not going to be at an Indian Ed event or, a junior high football game involving a kid from my tribe. This is, it's a way just to help keep that connection and to help build that community a little bit better.
Well, I wanted to also ask about an organization that I think you all are connected with. Could you talk a little bit about the work of the Native American Journalists Association? Maybe Bryan, you could start us off here.
All right. So I tend to describe what we do kind of in 3 buckets of work. One is to support our membership, to make sure that they have the resources and the training that they need to be able to compete in kind of the modern landscape of journalism, whether they're working in tribal media or in mainstream media. And so we do just a lot of support to ensure that our journalists have what they need, and also to bring up the next generation of storytellers. And so we have a fellowship that Lenzy is actually the director of, that she can speak more about. The second bucket is that we advocate for press freedom in Indian country, which we've already talked a little bit about. But that's, what we find is that press freedom is very inconsistent across Indian country. And so we're always advocating for tribes to implement greater and greater protections to ensure that tribal media outlets have an independent voice. And then the third bucket is also to ensure that portrayals of Indigenous people and communities and affairs are accurate and contextual, and that our counterparts in mainstream media are not perpetuating tropes and stereotypes about Native people, but are actually covering our communities in an ethical and responsible way.
Lenzy or Graham, would you like to add anything to that?
Bryan covered a lot of it, although I do want to make sure that folks understand that we are actively trying to build that next generation. Like as Graham mentioned, Natives account for less than 0.5% of newsrooms. And that pipeline is vital. That's why we have a fellowship. That's why we offer college scholarships, so that our students, the next generation, is able to go, oh, okay, so there is somebody in this business that looks like me. There is a place for me. I'm not alone. I can do this, and doing it in a manner that is respectful of our traditions, our cultures, and our heritage. Whether you're Cherokee, Navajo, pick your tribe. There are 600 plus tribes on Turtle Island, so there's not just an all-encompassing one Native tradition. So.
Well, Graham, you and I have talked a little bit about one of the major challenges to Indigenous media is the ability that Bryan referred to, the ability to have freedom of the press. And this is a fascinating part of the story that I'd love to explore a bit. Graham, could you talk a bit about some of the real challenges to press freedoms in Indian country?
Yeah, I think Bryan would definitely be the best person to talk to about this as well. But essentially, very few tribes have written press freedoms in their constitution, and tribes aren't subject to the same open records and transparency laws that my city, state, or federal government is. And so it's difficult for tribal papers to cover their governments for that reason. But if you don't have press freedoms put in your constitution, or if your tribe chooses to ignore the ones that are there, then you're essentially having to answer to the people that you're trying to cover and hold accountable. And so it presents an obvious ethical problem. And so part of the work that we do is try to consult with tribes about how to implement and construct better, stronger press freedoms, and how to abide by them when an issue arises. But Bryan, I think you should probably pick up from here, considering you've done so much research and work in this area.
Yeah, no, everything that you said was right. And I think that an important thing that most people may not know, but is important to understand, is that there is an inherent conflict with many tribal media outlets, because tribal media outlets often have very small audiences, and they can be in remote locations, which means that a traditional media business model is really not going to be viable, one that relies on subscriptions and advertising, which means that oftentimes tribal media outlets must be funded either in whole or in part by the tribal government itself, which in and of itself is not bad unless there is not some sort of a policy framework or firewall in place that separates the political functions of the government from the editorial functions and the independence of the tribal media outlet. And so what we see across most of Indian country is that firewall does not exist, which means that press freedom is really on the honor system in much of Indian country. And unfortunately, when politics comes into play, the honor system may not be the greatest method for ensuring press freedom. So that's why Naja is an advocate for policy. When tribes like the Osage Nation, for example, or the Muskogee Creek Nation, when they implement laws that provide statutory protection and editorial independence for the outlets, then we see them experiencing the kind of journalism that we all recognize as being kind of professional, independent journalism with an independent voice. If that policy framework is not in place, then you really don't know what you're going to get, and it could vary dramatically from one administration to the next within the tribal government. And so what we're trying to do is eliminate a lot of that inconsistency through policy.
So there have been some successes in this area with some tribes instituting legislation that some tribal laws that have ensured press freedoms in an effective way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing is, it's kind of like democracy itself. It's an ongoing experiment, but we do have a small body of best practices that have been developed over the years. In 2000, the Cherokee Nation passed its Independent Press Act, which in many ways was a very good act, and has had a lot of success since that time. In 2008, the Osage News passed a very similar act, and the Osage News today is one of the most strong and independent tribal media outlets in all of Indian country. 2015, the Muskogee Creek Nation gave independence to Muskogee Media, and in 2016, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde gave independence through legislation to its tribal newspaper called Smoke Signals. And so when you look at all those individual examples, there are definitely things that tie them together that make them effective, and those are forming into what we consider to be best practices. And so those best practices are now available to all tribes to examine and possibly implement if they want to increase press freedom in their community.
Have any of you had personal experiences that you might want to share with investigative journalism being particularly difficult in Indigenous media? If you don't want to share, I completely understand. But if you have any personal examples, I'd be curious to hear them.
Lenzy?
My daughter actually enjoys telling this story to her classmates, how her mommy got found in a closet by a police officer trying to cover a meeting. This would have been, oh gosh, 2014, I think. Covering Pawnee Nation for the late great Native American Times. The Pawnee Nation does not have press freedoms. And I am not a citizen of the Pawnee Nation. So under their legal code and their constitution, I have no legal right to sit in on tribal council meetings, things like that, or request records. There was a community meeting regarding how the tribe was going to spend a federal settlement. And there were quite a few elders that had called wanting coverage, wanting like, hey, what's going on? Can you do this? Da-da-da-da-da-da. So I drove out to Pawnee, showed up, sat in the back, was escorted out. And right after I was escorted out, an elder pulled me aside. You're the Native Times reporter, right? Yes, ma'am. Get in the closet. When an elder tells you to get in the closet, yes, ma'am. I managed to stay in the closet for a good 3-4 hours taking notes. I sneezed, and that's how I got caught, unfortunately. But I mean,
Wow.
Yeah. And was promptly was escorted off the complex by tribal police. I jokingly say that my name was a dirty word in Pawnee for a while because of that. So yeah.
Are there certain topics that are particularly difficult for Indigenous media outlets to cover, or are there types of stories that you wish would maybe get more attention?
Oh, Lenzy may have some other thoughts on this, but money. When you're talking about tribal budgets, how money is being spent, that's always contentious, particularly when it comes to gaming revenues. That's an issue where the tribal citizens have a very keen interest in understanding where the money's coming from and where it's going. And many tribal officials may not necessarily want to share that information. So I would say that reporting on money and budgets is always going to be contentious.
I would expand it not just on the gaming dollars, but 8A contracts or any businesses that, that business entities that are operated by a tribe, it's again, the secrecy is still there, but tribal citizens want to know and have a right to know, frankly, where does the money come from? How's it being spent, or how is it not being spent?
Yeah.
Graham, I'm curious. I wanted to ask you, do you feel like journalists are perceived differently in Indian country than they are perceived outside of Indian country? Are Indigenous journalists themselves seen differently, do you think?
I think, well, I can say that I think non-Indigenous journalists are viewed differently in Indian country. For sure. There's a high level of distrust typically in Indian communities when it comes to mainstream American journalism. I think if you look to the coverage of Standing Rock, you can kind of see why. It's a good example of how, while I do appreciate the fact that what happened at Standing Rock gave editors the notion that Native communities are actually worth covering. That story is a good example of how an Indigenous story that was really important was kind of waiting to be told, but it didn't get national headlines until basically the people on camera played Indian. So when it became Cowboys versus Indians, whenever people were being assaulted with concussion grenades and rubber bullets in freezing water and freezing temperatures, that's when places like the New York Times and the Washington Post decided to give it some time. But that story existed in court documents and memos and tribal council meetings with pipeline executives for at least a couple years before it made national headlines. So when you see things like that, and then the coverage obviously fit into a lot of stereotypes as well. And so I think when you constantly see your community presented in a way that you don't identify with, and only presented in the media when a perceived tragedy or trauma is happening, then you don't build a lot of trust with the institutions that produce that media. And so a question that I get every single time I train non-native newsrooms how to cover Indian country is, how do I build sources? And my answer to that is, it takes a lot of time. You are 50% a reporter and 50% a diplomat if you want to cover Indian country and you've never written about it before, because you're either going to be apologizing for your publication's lack of ever covering them or their bad coverage of their community. And so, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes showing those communities that you're there to cover things that aren't necessarily just terrible. And you're interested in getting to know their community as the well-rounded, diverse and multifaceted place that it probably is.
Graham, are there some other lessons that you try to teach non-native journalists for how to cover Indigenous communities?
I think one of the biggest takeaways that I hope people have is that they look at the news and they look at the way that policy and government policy in Indian country in a different way. And so an example I've been giving a lot lately is that, there's a lot of focus on a couple things that impact the Navajo Nation in particular with the pandemic, which was the lack of running water and the lack of adequate medical services at Indian Health Services. The federal government institution, tasked with providing medical care to Native people. Neither one of those problems are a mistake. They're by design. And so I try to remind reporters that I train that, colonialism didn't happen in the past and then we're here today. It's a structure that we still live inside of, and it still informs and drives government policy in Indian country. And in some other interesting ways that don't involve Native people too. So, the lack of running water, the lack of, the taxes and the subsidies that those people would need to build that kind of infrastructure could be provided if the federal government wanted them to be there. And we typically see the headline or the mentioned that Indian Health Services is underfunded, and I wouldn't disagree that it doesn't have the money it needs to function and provide adequate health care. But that is Congress deciding that it doesn't want to give it enough money, even though by treaty, it has agreed as a government to do so. So it's not necessarily being underfunded, it's Congress breaking the law every day. And so I think just trying to get reporters to ask themselves different questions. Just real quickly, I'll give you an example. There was a story that I use as an example sometimes in the training sessions, and it's about a town in southern Kansas that was a small rural town, and they found a town underneath it and excavated it. And if you are from Indian town in rural Kansas, and there was always rumors of a town underneath. And from the perspective of Indian country, that lead would be there's a sleepy little town in Kansas, and then somebody came and built a town on top of it. And so you just need to ask yourself how colonialism has shaped the landscape, both philosophically and physically, and apply that to your coverage.
Bryan or Lenzy, do you have any thoughts about how journalists are perceived in Indian country, maybe differently than they're perceived in other communities?
If you want to go ahead, Bryan, I don't go for it.
All right. I was just going to say that I think that that in my experience, the tension that Indigenous journalists experience when they're reporting within their communities is not between them and the people, or the people that they are reporting for and about. It's almost always between government and tribal media, because government wants to, government officials sometimes want to have a certain amount of control over what's published in tribal media. And so it creates a tremendous amount of tension between Indigenous journalists who just want to do their jobs and tribal officials who, want to have control over what kind of information gets out to the people. And so I find that is a much more common source of tension than what we see today in mainstream society, where there's kind of this public backlash against media with calls of fake news and all that stuff. I don't know that that's experienced so much in Indigenous communities.
I did want to ask that if any of you as working journalists have experienced a charge of fake news directed towards your work, and what are the best ways to respond to that? What happened, Lenzy?
Well, actually, I got it when I was doing work for a mainstream outlet. So, I had to put that disclosure out. Honestly, and I hear it more when I work, when I'm on a mainstream assignment versus when I'm out on assignment for Osage News or for the Humanities, which is the Citizen Potawatomi Nation's newspaper. And as hard as it is for me at this point, I just bite my tongue and walk on and ignore. So that, and Mr. KB has made it clear more than once that he really doesn't want to have to bail me out for punching somebody out for saying that, unless it's absolutely worth it. So.
Bryan or Graham, have you experienced that charge in your work?
Yeah, certainly. It's essentially anytime I've ever written anything for the New York Times, I get a deluge of hateful tweets. But like Lenzy said, you just ignore them. They're either a troll or a bot, or they're somebody that you probably shouldn't waste your time trying to be reasonable with. So you just move on.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of Indigenous media outlets for non-Indigenous populations. I know there are areas in Oklahoma and other states where Indigenous media outlets are now some of the only sources of local coverage. Is that the case?
There are definitely some areas where that is the case. Bryan and I both mentioned Osage News. They were the first ones that come to mind. Osage County is one of the biggest counties, and if not the biggest county in Oklahoma. but Osage News is has the largest circulating newspaper that's based in that county. They're one of my regulars. I spent most of the day working on a story for them, not chasing down tribal officials, but reaching out to the superintendents of local school districts to talk COVID and asking, okay, how many kids are in quarantine? When are you pivoting to distance learning? Things like that. No, that's not tribe specific, but tribal citizens' kids go there. Non-Osage readers, non-Osages read that paper. They need to know too. Graham gave a shout out to the Cheyenne and Arapaho Tribal Tribune earlier. You know, the folks out there are also covering those small rural schools out near Watonga, El Reno, Concho. I know there's that one district that they always, was it Darlington? You know, these little districts where not everybody there is a tribal citizen, but the Oklahoman's not sending people out there. The El Reno papers got their hands full. The Watonga Republicans got their hands full. So it's there. They're part of our community. We got to cover them too.
Yeah. And, you know, just speaking of Osage News, like when Killers of the Flower Moon got its, you know, big movie deal and Scorsese's, you know, walking around Oklahoma talking about how he wants to make a Western, the only paper that I could turn to get an actual, you know, to actually know what the Osage people think about this whole situation was Shannon Shaw Duty's articles at the Osage News. She was the only one who had access to the exact community that was going to be portrayed in his film. And so, yeah, they're a really important news source.
And Cody Hammer's photos got picked up from AP from those meetings with Scorsese and Chief Standing Bear. So.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, and I agree with all of it, is that, you know, if you're just taking Oklahoma as an example, if you're a resident of northeastern Oklahoma and you're not Cherokee, you would have a vested interest in following the Cherokee Phoenix because the Cherokee Nation has a gigantic impact on that part of the state. And the way that Cherokee Nation goes, that region goes. And so if you're interested in your community, whether you're in Cherokee or not, or Indigenous or not, it is in your interest to follow tribal media to understand what's going on within those tribal governments, because they have such a huge impact on those communities and on those regions.
Bryan, you talked a little bit about the kind of the financial models being different for Indigenous media versus other media. And we've seen examples all across the state and the nation of the consolidation and contraction of local media outlets. Has that phenomenon affected Indigenous media sources as well?
Not in the same way that it has affected mainstream. I think that, to be perfectly frank, the expansion and contraction that we see in tribal media outlet budgets is oftentimes more due to politics than it is to any kind of real economic pressures. The purse strings are one of the primary means that tribal governments use to control tribal media outlets. And oftentimes, even the laws that may be in place won't protect them from budgetary changes or restrictions. And so tribal governments will use the purse strings and budget cuts as a means to control tribal media, sometimes to punish tribal media. And so oftentimes when we see those kinds of contractions like you mentioned, I think it's more due to politics than it is economics.
Graham or Lenzy, would you agree with that?
With respect to tribally owned media outlets, yes. There are a handful of independent tribal or Indigenous focused media outlets that have been victims. The late great Native Times had to fold because of the economic downturn. I know there's somebody else I'm trying to think. There was another outlet in the state that I know has folded within the last few years. I'm drawing a blank. I'll probably think of it, right after we get off. But as far as with respect to tribally operated Indigenous media, yeah, Bryan's spot on.
Are there still thriving outlets that are thriving media outlets in Indian country that are independent of tribal financing?
Indian country today,
Yeah, Navajo Times.
Times, Native America Calling.
Yeah. Um, yeah,
What
National
are,
Native News.
There are a handful. They're few and far
Yeah.
between, but they are there.
Yeah.
I did want to ask what outlets, what websites or other media resources you would recommend to people listening to this and viewing this to get good examples of Indigenous media sources. If maybe each of you could recommend a site or two.
Yeah, well, certainly the ones that we've already mentioned, the Cherokee Phoenix, the Osage News, Muskogee Media, Smoke Signals, Indian Country Today, National Native News. There's all kinds. One thing that I would like to plug while we're talking is if you go to the NAJA website at naja.com, there is in the menu, in the drop-down menu, you'll find under the Red Press Initiative, which is our study of press freedom in Indian country, there's a pop-out menu that will guide you to a tribal media map. And that's actually it's not complete, but it's a fairly complete geographic map of all the tribal media outlets, and it's color-coded by platform. In other words, are they a website? Are they a newspaper? Are they a radio station, a television broadcast, that kind of thing?
Oh,
And that's a really great way to just kind of at a glance get an understanding of really what the tribal media landscape across North America looks like.
How about are there non-Indigenous media sources that you feel like have done a good job recently of covering stories in Indian country?
I'll brag on our desk a little bit. At High Country News, I don't know if it's still the case, but when we started out a few years ago, we were the only national media organization with a desk fully devoted to the coverage of Indian country. We hire Indigenous journalists to cover their own communities, and we try to do a lot of three-dimensional on-the-ground reporting and ask those more nuanced questions like we've been discussing tonight about, the deeper implications about why these things are the way they are. And I think an important component of that to me is also, what does equity look like, and how do we get there? So, and then I'd also say Indians.com, Indians with a Z at the end and not an S, is a really good aggregate for tribal media and coverage of tribal communities all across the nation.
Native
Graham,
News Online. Yeah.
Ah,
That's another one.
Graham, you mentioned one to me that I think is it a teen magazine that?
Yeah, I've always said that Teen Vogue does an amazing
Yeah.
job of covering Indigenous issues. It's typically because they hire Indigenous people to write perspective or analysis pieces about whatever issue or community that it caught the national attention at the time. But yeah, they always do a really good job. And I think, again, that's because they hire Native journalists.
Lenzy, are there any others that you might recommend that haven't been mentioned yet?
The Guardian is usually pretty good about bringing in Indigenous journalists to cover issues. And
Okay, Guardian.
the Guardian, the one is in the folks based out of London now. And she's still getting, obviously it's a little difficult being a one-woman band, but Allison Herrera at KOSU, KOSU has made a point to have an Indigenous affairs reporter. So, I mean, obviously that's a heavy lift for one woman to cover a whole state, but so far she's been doing a really solid job, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. So she started in that gig right before COVID hit. So.
Yeah, and also the Texas Observer which
Yes.
is based in Austin, is I think the most recent example of an Indigenous affairs desk that's dedicated to Indigenous coverage.
Well, one of the missions of this initiative that we're doing about journalism and the humanities is to allow citizens to have a better understanding of what it's like to be a journalist, what your work is like, what's important to you. And I wondered if I could ask each of you, are there some key things that citizens should understand about you and your work that might increase trust in the media? Maybe Lenzy, if you could address that first.
We're your neighbors. We don't have an axe to grind. We're not some faceless, faceless boogeyman that's been bought and paid off by somebody. We are supposed to be getting paid off. I missed that memo. We're human. We're not perfect, but we're trying our damnedest to be perfect, at least with respect to our coverage.
Bryan or Graham, how would you address that?
I would actually, as media has evolved, particularly with social media now becoming so prominent as a platform where people get news, I think it's important to remember that as journalists, we abide by a code of ethics, and it's something that provides guide rails to ensure that what we're reporting is accurate and truthful, so that people have a truthful idea of what's happening in society and in their communities. And that is to be distinguished from what you might get if you're just scrolling through your social media feed. And so I think that's an important thing for people to remember, is that, someone who is practicing professional journalism is guided by a code of ethics to try to ensure that what they're reporting is truthful.
Yeah, and it takes a long time and a lot of hard work to build that up. Like, the only thing that makes me different from any other person on the street who's asking the same questions is my reputation and my people's trust in my ability to do that job well. When I was a reporter at the Oklahoman and I would go walk across downtown Oklahoma City to the courthouse to watch a court proceeding, if I had my Oklahoman press badge around my neck, the police officer just let me walk through the metal detector. He let me cut the line and walk right through. And if it beeped and blared, he just said, "All right, have a good day." Like, I could have easily carried a gun into that building any day I wanted, but he knew that I was trustworthy. He knew that I was there to represent the community. And so I think just keeping that in mind, and in that same regard, in terms of how people should think about us, I mean, look to us as people who can help you solve a situation where government officials or whoever don't want to. That idea that squeaky wheel gets the grease, or just like, I have a friend who, she used to say that whenever she'd get mad at someone, she didn't say, "I'm going to call my lawyer on you." She would say, "I'm going to call my journalist on you." So like, I think just it's interesting to me that people don't trust us so much. And when I think about the community journalists all around them, it's like, if you told that person the things that made you angry or you didn't trust about the government, I guarantee they would look into them for you and try to help you solve that problem. So I just think that that's a valuable thing for people to remember, is that we get some of our best stories when people just randomly call us and tell us about something really terrible or really unjust or really unequal. And we get incensed about it, and then we want to solve the problem. So yeah, look to us to help you when we can.
Or really great. I mean, people just will contact you with some amazing story, and you just haven't heard it before, but it turns into a great story. So it doesn't necessarily need to be something that's infuriating. It could be really joyful and uplifting as well.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I really appreciated getting your thoughts on these issues. Are there any key issues of what happens in the world of Indigenous media that maybe we haven't addressed tonight that we could, in the few moments we have left, that we should touch on?
I think in the future, when you see representations or stories about Indigenous people in the media, you should ask yourself where the Native voice is in this story, because if they're not present in the story you're reading or watching, then you're probably not getting the full context.
Mm. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate you all joining us here. And we will have another panel discussion next Thursday, October 15th at 6:30 p.m. We'll be discussing hyperlocal journalism with a political science and journalism professor and two hyperlocal journalists from here in Oklahoma. So I hope everyone will join us. And I thank all of our panelists again, Lenzy, Bryan, and Graham. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.